I haven't studied the whole report yet, but I would just say that it is a very useful report. It's very helpful in trying to quantify the impact of expenditure allocations and targets, where until we had this document, you didn't really know what the outcomes were. So it's extremely helpful in assessing whether targets set and monies allocated are actually delivering what they were intended to deliver. So it's extremely useful. Some of the very useful things, like seeing the housing stuff, for example, is extremely interesting, on the percentage difference in the net number of households qualified for social housing since 2016. It's a fascinating figure. And this is more down to the department than you, but I think it's interesting that it has dropped 32%, 35% and 36%. Incredible. So at a time when more people are unable to afford market prices or rents, there's less people by a very significant margin each year actually entitled to social housing support. It's a shocking fact, but it's very helpful for you to detail that. The only thing I would say, and so there's a lot of useful figures, and this would be very helpful for us in terms of, raising questions and so on. Maybe it's just too much to get in this, given the nature of the document, but, you probably know in that, say, if we take that section, housing, that there's a huge debate about what actually is social housing, if you know what I mean. How much of it is delivered by the local authorities? How much is delivered by approved housing bodies? How much of it is leasing? How much of it is acquisitions? There's different subcategories of social housing, and I don't know, would you feel, it would certainly be helpful for me, maybe for us generally, to see that broken down in a little bit more detail. So I'd be interested to know what you think about that, or is that just too much for you guys to break down things to that level of detail, where there's particular controversies and where establishing what the facts are is helpful, because often these things are disputed, as you know. So you might comment on that.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that this is a kind of a huge area for us every year when we look at it, because there's such a degree of complexity behind an awful lot of these metrics around just the things you said there, like around what's the denominator here, how are you defining this? Like there are whole programs of research around, like, each one of these metrics probably. What we do when we kind of get the information is like Caroline said, we do review it to make sure that it makes sense and that people should be able to kind of interpret it. But the detail around the definitions and the level of granularity that they're broken down into is something that in reality rests with the department at the moment.
So they decide basically what you get to put in this?
So yeah, so the way it works is that the departments have responsibility for reporting metrics at the programme level within their budgets. So the programs are expressed as like policy goals, and then those policy goals are broken down into output metrics and metrics on the outcomes that those outputs are supposed to improve.
Does that sort of give them the opportunity to, dare I say, flatter to deceive, or deceive, whatever that expression is, that they choose what information they choose to give rather than maybe what we might want to know?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is the possibility there that people pick the metrics that will, make them look the best. But it is within that context of it has to represent metrics that are relevant to the major programme level outcomes. So there is that structure around it. The other point as well that Caroline was making earlier too was that the kind of the sectoral committee process by which these results are interrogated is really crucial to to driving that improvement over time. So if departments are reporting metrics that don't really capture or don't really do a good job of characterising the major outcomes or the major policy impacts they're trying to have, then that should kind of be squeezed out over time as they're scrutinised every year.
But would the committees, I'm sorry if I'm asking dumb questions, but would the committees have looked at the drafts of what's to go in this and the metrics that are being used in each department, if you know what I mean?
We don't provide drafts to the committee, but what we would hope would happen, I suppose, what we expect to happen during the year is the committees use the information. So we try and promote the use of this information as much as we can. Yeah. So it's every deputy gets one, all the committees. We have, separate private sessions where we kind of explain the layout of it, and obviously through the PBO and all that. So what we would hope would happen that when different selectoral committees meet, that the information is used. And as we said earlier on, if it's not serving its best purpose, then we take the feedback and say. So
you will go to private session with every single committee?
If it's required, yeah. I mean, it's
no, if they look for it. If they look for it.
We offer it, so we've, through this committee, if there's another committee that says we would like to know more about the performance report, then yes, we will. And we've, as I said, we have an open door. I said earlier on, capacity building across both the civil service and the political. There's an open door for anybody who requires that from the performance budgeting unit in Depender.
And just as a matter of interest then, just to see how that works in practice, still like in the last few years, how long are the reports going now?
This is the 7th report.
The 7th one. Have committees come back to you and discussed with you what's in their particular section?
It's not that they talk about the exact metrics. They talk about the format of the metrics.
Right.
So that's as we said earlier on, we only have responsibility for the format, and then we obviously provide guidance to the departments when they're. But ultimately, the departments have to retain ownership of what metrics they select. Now, having said that, we can see that when a department or a committee says to a department or to ourselves, it would be really helpful for us in our work to have this certain information. And I think it was indeed yourself, Deputy, a couple of years ago that said to us that the targets were not included in the report. Yeah. And we took that on board, and the next year now we include the targets, and we've gone so far as to have the little bar, so that it's very clear.
Percentages,
we try and make sure that it does exactly what it's supposed to do, that it's used as the tool it should be.
Well, I would just say in relation to that one, and I'm just picking it out as an instance, that, it doesn't, for example, include affordable housing in that metric. Or, it's just not included as a metric, which is an important one. And then even the subdivision of social housing. So, and now we've got cost rental and we've got affordable purchase. So I think if you take that one as an example, definitely we could do it a bit more detail there. Another one, these are just my kind of hobby horses, but I'm quite interested in the whole film area, and I note that it says how many feature films projects are delivered with funding from Screen Ireland, but I don't know. Some of the other, in fact, the biggest source of funding for film comes through finance, through Section 481. Is that covered in, I haven't had a chance to look at it, in the finance section? Tax expenditures?
Right, off the top of my head, I can pretty much. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, maybe that's a more general question. Tax expenditures. Yeah, I'm just looking at it now. Do tax expenditures get covered?
No, they don't. It's just the public expenditure. It's the breakdown of the budget allocations that are presented at the start of the chapters, but the metrics then are, I suppose, if they're brought about by tax expenditures, then you should be able to see the impact of that in the.
Well, one thing maybe then is something for our committee to consider, but I would say we've been discussing tax expenditures generally, and we've looked at some of them specifically, and we've kind of characterised them to some extent as a shadow budget, in that they are directed towards certain policy objectives, but they're kind of treated differently from direct expenditures. And we've questioned actually that there should be a hell of a lot more scrutiny of them. And is there any good reason that they shouldn't be included in this, if you know what I mean? Because they're large amounts of money that are spent to achieve certain policy objectives, and yet we don't really know, because they're not scrutinised, do they actually deliver their policy objectives? And some of them, you know, we're trying to push, our committee has been pushing that they should be more sort of, what's the word, in the spotlight during the budgetary period, so that the government should have to justify the rolling over of certain tax expenditures or new tax expenditures, or deciding to get rid of certain tax expenditures that maybe have outlived their usefulness or aren't achieving what they were supposed to achieve. So what would you think about us trying to bring the tax expenditures into all this?
Yeah, I certainly take your point. You know, like when you're trying to relate back, like the delivery or the achievement of goals and the difference that public policy has made on the ground, you do. If you were trying to relate back to how much resources were allocated to it, yeah. I mean, it would paint a better picture of it. So it's certainly something we'll consider.
Yeah. One further comment as well. It's just, I suppose the challenge that we've always had with this report is we want it to be accessible. We want it to be something that somebody, as we said, you know, with no financial background can pick up and at a glance. Yeah. So I suppose we have had issues, you know, before where we've said, oh, will we include this or not? But it's trying to strike the balance between accessibility.
Yeah, no, I get that. And you don't want to sort of have it so dense with detail and fine print and whatnot that it just becomes unreadable. But I definitely think tax expenditures are a huge area. I mean, in the case of film, for example, the biggest source of funding for film isn't the direct expenditure through Screen Ireland. The biggest expenditure is a tax credit. So, you know, and there may be other instances of that. Well, I'm sure there are. Do you know what I mean? Whether there's, I think in forestry, for example, there are tax reliefs that are a significant part of trying to deliver forestry, as well as the direct expenditures by the department, you know, and that it would make sense that we're kind of seeing them all together.
You needed your 10 minutes after all.
Right, sorry. Thanks very much.
No, but I think that's a very valuable suggestion coming from the committee, that we'd have a tax expenditure evaluation, or to see, and you might let us know as a committee if it's possible to do that within the context of the Public Service Performance Report. Just an extra chapter. Okay, thank you.